Yeah.
Hey everybody, I'm Aaron Simmons, and this is the exclusive content bonus video for subscribers to my newsletter for December 2023. I hope you are all rocking, doing great, really celebrating the holidays, having just gotten through Thanksgiving, making our way onward toward whatever other holidays we celebrate during this season. I am so glad that you are joining me today to think about some philosophy in a little bit more extended form than I normally am able to do on my YouTube channel. So this month in the newsletter, what I'm doing is thinking about relationships and how relationships not only are defining of our holiday seasons, but also of the kinds of lives we live as the beings we are, that we are defined by, I suggest in my new book, Camping with Kierkegaard, we are vulnerable, but we are also relational. Those two components are part of what make us who we are, and it's also what then makes our relationship to everyone else a relationship to their relational vulnerability. This is actually something I think that is profoundly important for not only our philosophical reflection, but also for our ethical existence and our social lives. The way we navigate the world with each other is anchored in an awareness of our vulnerability as mutual and also our relational engagement as constitutive of how we understand ourselves in the world. We are neither isolated egos, nor are we invulnerable, infallible gods, right? We are flawed, fragile, finite, but that may be the source of the glory that actually underwrites the human condition in its shared capacities. Now, in order to think about that general theme and unpack it in a fairly specific philosophical way, I've decided to talk about the philosophy of Gianni Vattimo. Vattimo actually just passed away this September, a couple months ago. And in honor of his life, his legacy, I want to think about the sort of big arc of his philosophy of religion. Now, I'm not going to get into the weeds, though I am going to give a little bit more depth than I was able to do in my recent YouTube video, because this isn't a graduate seminar on phenomenology and hermeneutic philosophy, right? I'm trying to invite you, whatever your background, whatever your experience, to think with me about different ways of thinking about our existence, our life, and our shared loves, our shared loyalties. So when we talk about Vattimo, I am not trying to give you all of the finer points about his inheritance of certain types of figures, his readings of hermeneutics, his understanding of nihilism. So for my philosophy pro watchers, please forgive that I'm going to overlook some of that in order to give what I think is a really compelling invitation to rethink where we are in light of a really interesting combination. The combination of Nietzsche and Heidegger on the one hand, and a retelling of what the truth of Christianity is all about on the other. So, without further ado, let's dive in and think a little bit about Gianni Vattimo. Now, Vattimo, an Italian Catholic who's a member of the European Parliament, his approach to philosophy is fundamentally hermeneutic, which means that he's really interested in interpretive possibilities, in thinking about the history of philosophy as propelling us into our current situations, our current lives, and in particular, our social lives with new alternatives. We find critical resources in light of the hermeneutic openings that he suggests. Well, in two books, After Christianity and Belief, we see a very particular story that he tells. And he does it by anchoring it in two different pithy slogans, things we could put on t-shirts or like flat-billed ball caps or something. The first is, when asked, do you still believe in God? Do you still believe in Christianity? His response is, I believe that I believe. And similarly, when he was asked to describe his Christianity, his response is, thanks to God, I'm an atheist. Now, Those two claims can sound really strange, but what I'm going to try to do is tell the basic through line of these two books with the attempt of coming back to those two pithy slogans so that we can understand them at the end. All right, let's dive in. Here's the story that he tells. So I wish I had a whiteboard. I could map this all out. I actually just gave this lecture to my philosophy religion class a couple days ago. It took me an hour and a half to do what I want to try to do in about 15 minutes. Imagine, if you will, a general timeline of broadly conceived Western culture. And so we're going to start this timeline with Greek metaphysics. And in Greek metaphysics, what we see is that being is positioned as the highest category, the highest concept, and in fact, the fundamental concept for metaphysical speculation. So we've got being at the top, non-being at the bottom, becoming in the middle. This is what gives rise famously to Plato's theory of forms. This is why philosophy is fundamentally about connecting us to what does not change, connects us to being. Now, in this sense, there is no need to think about being as God, but it is the case that you can probably already start to see what's going to happen as Greek metaphysics gets appropriated in light of the rise of Christianity. Think, for example, about the medieval period. Augustine, Aquinas, these sorts of thinkers, Anselm, what is it that they all suggest in very different ways, but they're all grounded in the basic idea that God is the highest, the most perfect, the best, the good. God is the sunum ans, the highest being, the sunum bonum, the highest good. God becomes the name given to the ultimate metaphysical principle, what my friend John Sanders calls the ump. God becomes the ump that is explanatory of the Greek metaphysical account, now though with agency behind it, right? So God is now not simply understood as a being internal to this system, but God is understood as the standard by which being then gets played out. Now, this is, you might understand, the beginnings of what eventually will be termed ontotheology, where we understand our theological concepts in terms of Greek metaphysical and ontological categories. God in terms of being. Ontos, theos, ontotheology. Okay, so far so good. Greek metaphysics gives rise to a very particular Christian deployment of those metaphysics such that God becomes the absolute standard of perfection by which everything else is then narrated and understood. Okay, move up a little further. What do we start to see? Well, we see the rise of other phenomena internal to this general Western history. We see not only the Renaissance, the emergence of a robust humanism, but we also see the emergence of the Reformation, a kind of rethinking of the authority structures by which this narrative of God as the highest being is understood. We have a challenging that starts going on, you might say, a kind of epical shift such that the traditional authorities and traditional standards were beginning to be rethought with the emergence of, we might say, a merchant class, with the emergence of new technologies like the printing press. A whole different sort of set of social circumstances invites a rethinking of those traditional conceptions of how God served as that highest explanatory principle. Well, move up a little further. We start seeing some real conflict starting to arise, right? Think Galileo and Copernicus. There starts to be a tension emerge between, on the one hand, the authority of the church appealing to this metaphysical sovereignty, and the authority of this newly deployed devotion to science and reason as actually allowing us insight in ways that don't require the revelational access of theological doctrine. Okay, this comes to a kind of high point with the Enlightenment. And in the Enlightenment, we start to see the age of reason take over, such that now it's not even clear that God is the highest, maybe reason, human capacities for reason are now the highest thing available. And so we continue to move religion further and further and further to the side because we're able to fill the gaps in our awareness and our understanding of the world via other methodologies. This, of course, gives rise as well to a very particular conception of liberalism, where we now have a public and private distinction. Publicly, we do this reason work, we do this science work. Privately, we do this religious stuff. This is where we get some very dangerous distinctions like fact and value being radically separated from each other. And we begin to start to see God, as Dietrich Bonhoeffer will eventually discuss, as a kind of God of the gaps. God stays in play where we don't yet have science and rationality to address the concerns. So, let's figure out where we've come. We start with Greek metaphysics. Being as the highest category, the highest concept, we move into a space where God becomes the ultimate metaphysical principle and actually now is identified with that highest being. This then moves forward and we start seeing some tension between the religious authority and what we might start to see as the non-religious authority. These authorities continue to pull apart from each other such that we end up with a very discrete modern political view of political life called liberalism that is now actually creating a legislated divide. On the one hand, between religion and the other hand, between, you might say, public life. Now, the way that that divide gets cashed out conceptually, historically, is between the secular and the sacred. Now, the secular-sacred distinction is a discrete product of a very particular modern inheritance, says Vattimo. That doesn't mean that there's not been a sacred and something other distinction that predates it. There was a sacred-profane distinction that goes way back. But the profane now has to start becoming something social. It has to be a category by which we make sense of our social lives and our engagement with each other. So the profane starts becoming now just the secular. And as we are moving forward, we begin to become increasingly secular in this particular cultural inheritance. And this occurs, according to Vattimo and others, many sociologists, in such a way that yields a particular hypothesis called the secularization hypothesis. And this is something that we can actively see playing out in the masters of suspicion, people like Marx, Freud, and Nietzsche, who begin to say, as we mature as a society, as we mature as a people, and even as we mature as individuals, we will leave religion further and further behind and become more and more and more secular as we embrace non-religious authorities for making sense of meaning in the world. Marx famously calls religion the opiate of the masses. Nietzsche famously says that God is dead and we killed God precisely because of these cultural moves that Vattimo has outlined. For Freud, religion is explicitly referred to as an immature illusion to be overcome through education and maturity. So the secularization thesis suggests that as we progress, we will increasingly become secular more and more and more and leave God further and further behind as the gaps where God fills in become smaller and smaller. Okay, there's a problem though. As we move into the second half of the 20th century, more and more people start turning to religion. This is what's sometimes referred to as the return of the religious revival that starts basically sweeping the globe. Well, here's the weird part about this. You would think that this then means secularization has run its course. We're now, moving from adolescence to mature adulthood, and now we're moving into a new life stage where religion comes back around. And as such, most folk now say the secularization hypothesis has failed. So if you look at people like Charles Taylor in A Secular Age, he will talk about the fact that the secularization hypothesis no longer holds up empirically because of the way in which religion has returned in that cultural and historic moment where it should have been the most diminished. Well, Vattimo says there are ultimately a variety of ways to make sense of this. And I want to suggest, this is going a little bit out of Vattimo, but I think it helps us understand some of the debates in philosophy of religion over the last 20 or 30 years. I want to suggest that there's basically two ways to understand that return of the religious. Now, it's important to understand, before we talk about these two options, the return of the religious is distinctive in the following sense. It returns not as a dynamic set of alternatives, but it returns as explicitly a very fundamentalist model of religious life. Now, this can happen in a variety of religious traditions, but in particular, think about the rise of white evangelicalism in America. This is not a return to religion that is recognizing liberal Protestantism alongside different models of being Catholic, alongside different ways of understanding orthodoxy and different Christian expressions. It's a way of trying to actually reinforce the boundaries by which what counts as religion so that we can narrow and narrow and narrow it in order to demarcate ever more clearly between the religious and the secular. So in some ways, the return of religion depends upon this secularization move in order to create what then gets narrated as a kind of culture war, fighting against humanism, fighting against this cultural decline. And in many ways, fighting against what is then termed postmodernism. Right? Where we've lost our moorings, lost our values, lost any authority to which we can claim to know the good. Well, enter a variety of philosophical options. There's two in particular that I want to point out. One is a movement that I think we see primarily in analytic philosophy of religion. And in this mode, and this is, again, is not a critique of that, it's to show different alternatives available. This is where we see the rise of Christian philosophy following the rise of religion. And it comes back in a very parallel sort of way where people like Nick Wolterstorff and Alvin Plantinga and George Mavrodes and others, William Alston, all start showing up and challenging what had become the sort of triumph of the secular in light of logical positivism. When this emergence of Christian philosophy really shows back up and starts to really gain ground in analytic philosophical circles, it's trying to suggest, I would claim, that the return of religion makes tons of sense in light of the secular emergence over the last 200-300 years, but it's shown back up in problematic ways. And so this is where the philosophers on this sort of generally analytic approach tend to suggest that it's fundamentalism that's a problem, but not theism. So we have robust apologetic discourses, robust defenses of Christian theism in a space that's trying to get away from, we might say, the anti-intellectualism of this religious return, mainly inaugurated by a broad swath of fundamentalist conceptions of Christian life. But alongside this kind of apologetic set of debates about classical theism, and of course there's also many atheistic philosophers in that same debate, also trying to suggest that the better arguments, the more sophisticated view actually falls flat. There are good objections to all of these views. So it's not that there's just these Christian philosophers and that's analytic philosophy of religion. It's a Christian set of debates where atheistic philosophers also engage in ways to say we've got to raise the level at which religion returns. Or, according to atheist views, according to which the return of religion is now seen as problematic, not because secularization is this cultural wave, but because the arguments for theism fail. Vattimo and generally continental philosophy of religion takes a slightly different tact here. And similarly opposed to fundamentalism, it wants to suggest, look, the return to religion is actually really sensible, given the fact that this loss of moorings that are, being felt by so many, that they are reacting so violently against, is a real phenomenological experience. But the way that we replace those sorts of feelings of loss is not to return to the outmoded metaphysics, the model, the authoritative conception of the divine. What we need to do is now rethink the divine for a postmodern world. These two alternatives, better defenses of classical theism and different alternatives to what theism can mean, are what I would suggest the kind of content differences that do show up to some degree in analytic and continental approaches. Now, in that space, enter Vattimo. Vattimo, having told this story, is now trying to make sense of the way in which this secularization progression and the return of religion on the backside of it actually runs parallel to a very particular philosophical inheritance of that Greek metaphysics that gave rise to, in some ways, the progression itself. So he turns here to Nietzsche and Heidegger. And so we'll focus in on both, but to varying degrees. For Nietzsche, when he says God is dead and we have killed the divine, part of what Vattimo is trying to suggest is Nietzsche doesn't mean, therefore be atheists. Therefore there is no God. Therefore classical theism is false. What it is that Vattimo sees in Nietzsche, and I think this is right, is a reminder that hermeneutic interpretation, that requirement of deciding what will be true for us, the fact that there are a play of different ways to make sense of the same fact, that requirement, that hermeneutic task, is actually the hallmark of the postmodern world. Rather than appealing to capital R reason, rather appealing to a sense of the human as actually able to triumph over all of the questions, what we now see is a kind of deepening of responsibility in light of the ways in which we have gotten over our skis, as it were, in the modern arrogance that we have now inherited. So when Nietzsche says God is dead and our responsibility emerges as a result, this again is not an atheistic thesis. It's actually a thesis about the way in which we are confronted with an interpretive task in light of the history we find ourselves living. Heidegger gives us a slightly different story, whereby he goes back and says that Greek metaphysical idea, we now need to radically challenge that Greek metaphysics in a way, in light of people like Nietzsche and Marx and others, where we now can restore the meaning of the question of being, the question of the meaning of being. That being now emerges as a kind of question mark rather than exclamation point for our theories. So for Heidegger, when we talk about the history of Western ontology, it's actually a discussion about how that history has been a history of weakening. Being started as the apex of our conceptual hierarchy, and now he says being is no longer able to be seen as a being, as the highest being, as God. We now have to see being as always the being of a being, discovered, understood, engaged, considered in its concretion as a lived fact. In other words, we've gone from being as the divine in heaven to being as the concrete life of beings like us asking questions about who we are. Now, Vattimo says, in light of Nietzsche's hermeneutic task, in light of Heidegger's thesis about the weakening of being across the history of Western ontology, we can now start to draw some really fascinating parallels. And those parallels run like this. On the one hand, we have the story of the increasing secularization in Western culture. And on the other hand, we have a philosophical account of the increased weakening of our concept of being as we move into a post-metaphysical framework. Those two things, he suggests, are not unconnected. Now, he's a little bit tricky about, is there a causal relationship? He's more wanting to say that they are what he refers to as a family resemblance, that they're moving analogously, and there's a reason why they do. Here's the thought. Secularization emerges not just in some culture, but in Christian culture, precisely, he says, because we actually have an account in Christian culture of God radically emptying God's self. The term is kenosis, self-emptying or self-humbling. God steps out of the forms, out of the realm of divine heaven, into the messy, vulnerable, relational life of humanity. Now, that story, which of course any Christian would be able to tell, right? God loved the world so much that Jesus came to the world, became a human, died in the world, and this is how we then have a kind of redemptive participation in God's love. That story, that kind of Billy Graham version of it, is what Vattimo is trying to then take and say, but what if we started to recognize that content of the story of how Christianity works, the theological narrative, runs directly opposed to this history of metaphysics, this history of God as the supreme being? What if we begin to start to see this canonic account of the Christian gospel as parallel also to the story of the weakening of being, the story of the secularization of society? Now, he says, we can begin to understand that secularization is not opposed to religion, but is the truth of Christianity. The more we move into the truth of a God who empties God's self into relational, vulnerable existence, the closer we become to really seeing the face of God in the face of every one of our neighbors. Not surprisingly, when liberalism emerges and we see the American and the French Revolution start to occur as a result, we start to have ideas of fraternity, of liberty, of relational investment in the pursuit of fulfillment and happiness. He wants to suggest that that's not, radically strange. This is actually deeply necessary. As we move into secularization, we are now culturally embodying the very truth that Christianity has always taught. God is not to be understood as detached, as removed from, but God is now fully invested as what he calls a friend. God walks with rather than standing above. Now, if this is right, a couple things follow. One, the weakening then of being in the Heideggerian story and the death of God as told by Nietzsche, though both atheistic philosophers, they actually are closer to getting right what Christianity has always been inviting us to think about regarding a post-metaphysical horizon for human existence. We are anti-human so long as we think the goal of religious existence is to remove ourselves from the human condition through some sort of salvific act. And so this is where he then comes back and says, the traditional authoritative metaphysical model of God, as displayed in much of classical theism, has two problems. The first problem is it's fundamentally violent, right? Because God's wrath needs appeased by the death of Jesus. A sacrifice needs paid. And two, it's fundamentally anti-human because it requires that death, that sacrifice, to forgive sins, to allow us to overcome our human condition, to become something else, to become a son and daughter of God. Fundamentally violent and fundamentally anti-human. But notice, rather than the return of fundamentalist religion getting Christianity right, it is actually the anti-Christ. It is anti the story of the canonic self-emptying of a God who walks with us in love as friends. What gets God right? What understands Christianity? Heidegger's weakening ontology, Nietzsche's theory of the death of God, and the secularization that has largely defined Western liberal democracies for the last couple hundred years. Secularization is the truth of Christianity because it overcomes the problems of penal substitution, and it overcomes the problems of anti-humanism. So no wonder that when the return of religion is occurring in the second half of the 20th century, there is a deep worry about secular humanism. Vattimo's point is because secular humanism is the most Christian option in play. But that's a big problem for people who need God and needs the state to stand as authoritative regulators, guaranteeing that we are the ones who are the victors in this historical story. A kenotic God invites us to rethink the task of victory. Maybe it's to be faithful to the call of neighbor love, rather than to be triumphant in ensuring a theocracy. There's his proposal. Well, in light of that proposal, now I want to come back to what he says are the two big theses for which he's argued. And then I want to conclude by returning to our two pithy slogans. Here are the two theses that he says he's argued for. And I've again kind of given you the story by which this argument is laid out. First, the revival of religion in a post-metaphysical age is not exclusively the outcome of a misunderstanding. In other words, it wasn't that they just didn't read their Durkheim, right? They just didn't understand their sociology. The fools, the ignorant fools running back to God. Instead, they returned to God in a very sensible way, given the result of the secularization process that then eliminates the kind of guaranteed authority structure that we often think we want. The return to religion is not, he says, based on simply a misunderstanding. It's actively understanding the risks involved in a kenotic God and a radical democracy. It can appear, this return of religion in post-metaphysical world, in its theoretical legitimacy if we recognize the deep family resemblance between the Western religious tradition and the idea of being as an event with the destiny of weakening. In other words, the Nietzschean Heideggerian sort of story about philosophy and metaphysics and the trajectory of secularization, these in fact run parallel tracks. Second, the recognition of this family resemblance offers philosophy the basis for a critical reflection on the forms that the sacred has taken in our time. In other words, it gives us the resources to be critical of the authoritative model of classical theism so often deployed as simply the only thing that can save us from the cultural and moral decline of our secular society. It actually gives us the resources to interrogate the options that are presented as exclusive. Whenever it betrays its constitutive anti-metaphysical inspiration, in other words, whenever we take seriously the return of religion as actively a positive manifestation of a post-metaphysical upsurge, the weakening of being, the revival of religion now must be subjected to philosophical criticism. In other words, the return of religion must be interrogated not by a rejection of religion, but by philosophy taking seriously what religion might actually be manifesting in its hermeneutic cultural inheritance. If we ask why this vision of the history of being as the destiny of weakening should be persuasive, so why should we be convinced of this? The following answer comes to mind. It is because we are the heirs of a tradition that has absorbed Christian values like brotherhood, charity, and nonviolence. This vision has its foundation in the idea of redemption and the idea of incarnation, the kenosis of God. In other words, why is it that we find ourselves maybe persuaded by this parallel track actually being connected? Why are we interested in the philosophical resources it provides? Precisely because we all have inherited, regardless of our current religious identity, how we would define ourselves, we've all inherited the fundamental ethical commitment that Christianity triumphed as radical humility. right? Christianity's biggest point is the goal is not to win, but actually to invite, to be hospitable, to show openness to the other. If that's deep in our kind of liberal democratic hearts, he's suggesting it's probably because we have inherited this Christian moral idea as latent in our social imagination. Now, you might say, well, but how would that show up? This post-metaphysical stuff, what's that got to do with ethics? Well, elsewhere he will suggest, quote, "We have sought to think being outside the metaphysics of objectivity precisely for ethical reasons. And the latter must guide us in our elaboration of the consequences of a non-metaphysical conception of being." In other words, we actually have challenged metaphysics in its Greek conception, the model, because of the way in which it does not open spaces for radical alterity. Insert Levinas, insert Derrida, right? Discourses on hospitality, on openness, on moral imperatives that go deeper than our ontological frame. Ontology, Levinas says, is not fundamental. Ethics is. Responsibility is. What I call relationality is. So if this relationality goes all the way down and metaphysics actually covers over that relationality in the name of a kind of radical egoism, an egolatry, where we become idols of our own metaphysical speculation, we challenge that view in the name of ethics, but in the name of what kind of ethics? Charity, the name of love, the openness to the neighbor. And this is where Levinas will say he's bringing Hebraic wisdom into the language of Greek philosophy. Vattimo is actually suggesting the inspiration of that Hebraic wisdom, the charity, the hospitality that runs so deep. This actually, he suggests, comes to fruition in the story of a God who is maximally manifest by taking on the vulnerability of flesh. Now, does God die for our sins on this model? Vattimo still wants to say yes, but not in the way that we used to think, not penal substitution and sacrifice, but God dies for our sins in the sense that we recognize the goal was never to be something other than human. The goal was to be better at being human, to realize that death is part of what constitutes our relationships to each other. How can we show love in light of that vulnerable status? God dies for our sins of egoism, says Vattimo, to invite us to rethink what it looks like to be human. So, we end then with this awareness of secularization, and he says the following. If it is in the mode in which the weakening of being realizes itself as the kenosis of God, right? If we've now bought this Christian story about what the weakening of being was always already saying, which then is the kernel of the history of salvation, secularization shall no longer be conceived of as abandonment of religion, but as the paradoxical realization of being's religious vocation. From the perspective of secularization, post-metaphysical philosophy will understand and criticize the multifaceted phenomena of religion's return in our culture, thus inescapably putting itself in question. In other words, as we begin to take his story seriously, we're going to start questioning what secularization has already meant, what it's doing. And so the return of religion now is not seen as this problem in relation to our goal of a secular society. The problem becomes our interpretation of secularization in the first place. But that means we also had a bad notion of religion. And now you can see where the options. Are you religious? Yes, I am this sort of thing. Are you not religious? I am an atheist. Where we end up with very particular discrete dichotomies. Enter now culture wars. Enter now political rushes to the bottom to make sure that what we're fighting for is fighting against those people. That's just the old model of the divine, of being as absolute authority, showing back up. It's no wonder that many of the return of religion fundamentalists are embracing increased authoritarian models of social life. Vattimo wants to suggest if we really love democracy, It turns out that we should be even more Christian, not less. And this is where it's important to understand, even Derrida, a Jewish thinker who says he rightly passes as an atheist, says at one point, if there is ever going to be a democracy worthy of the name, because it is radically hospitable, it will be a Christian democracy. It's the same point we see Vattimo making here. I believe that I believe. Thanks to God, I'm an atheist. What is it Vattimo says here? The options of classical theism, atheism, are in fact bad options. There are better options that we can embrace, and those options we can now embrace are to realize that maybe the most Christian way of living is to abandon what we so often see advertised and deployed as Christian truth. Thanks to God, this history of the Christian story of the weakening of being and the kenosis of God revealed in the narrative of Christ, thanks to God, atheism is possible because I don't have to affirm classical theism as the exclusive account of what religion means. I believe that I believe. Why? As he says at the end of his book, Belief, the very last line before his postscript, to believe in belief means a bit of all things. It may be to wager in the sense of Pascal, hoping to win while having no reassurance. To believe in belief, yet also hoping to believe. So we've lost our absolutist guarantees, but we have embraced our relational vulnerability. The risk is real. And as I argue in Camping with Kierkegaard, faith is risk with direction. The more we eliminate the risk with an authoritarian model, both of God and social life, the less faith we can enact as a social existence. All right, that's a lot. I ended up going 40 minutes. I apologize. I was hoping to keep it more like 20, but hopefully this is helpful. This is, again, a really complicated set of texts, and I'm just scratching the surface, but I do hope that it at least propels you into rethinking the options that we now consider exclusive, that we challenge the dichotomies we are being presented, and that we recognize there are other ways to think about where we are in order to create different hopes for what is possible to come. Thanks again. I hope I'll see you next time, unless a piano falls on our heads.